Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your podcast platform. It helps others to find us. And feel free also to send us questions and suggestions. Also, we're looking for sponsors to fund a marketing initiative to help us reach a wider audience. The future is rushing towards us, and the better informed we all are, the better it will be. We are honoured to have as our guest today Shamus Rae. Shamus is the co-founder of Engine B, a startup which aims to expedite the digitisation of the professional services industry, in particular the accounting and legal professions, and level the playing field so that small companies can compete with larger ones. It's supported by the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, the ICAEW, and the main audit firms. Shamus was ideally placed to launch Engine B, having spent 13 years as a partner at the audit firm KPMG, where he was head of innovation and digital disruption. But his background is in technology, not accounting, which will become clear as we talk. He is commendably sleeves rolled up and hands-on with AI models. Back in the 1990s, he founded and sold a technology-oriented outsourcing business, and then built a 17,000-strong outsourcing business for IBM in India from scratch. Shamus, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Callum. Thank you very much. And also thanks to David as well.
Thanks for joining us, Shamus.
Excellent. Looking forward to it.
Shamus, tell us what Engine B does and how it's going.
Engine B is really focused on data, mostly because we can do all the great things with generative AI and different kind of bits of automation at the top. If we don't have great data, and I would argue great data orchestrated into a standardized model, knowledge graphs, etc., then actually you're going to really struggle to ground a lot of this AI above. So we're totally focused on getting data out of clients, accounting firm clients and legal firm clients, pulling it in, standardizing it into a standard data format, which has been agreed by accountants and law firms, and then putting knowledge graphs on top. We use a lot of AI in the extraction process and the orchestration process and other clever bits and pieces. But yeah, that's what we do. It's the plumbing, which may not sound sexy to a lot of people, but we're a niche part of the internet. We think we're quite sexy.
Plumbing for accountants and lawyers. I mean, it sounds like you're using deep learning rather than generative AI. It sounds like you're kind of a first big bang AI company rather than a second big bang AI company. Is that right?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, yes, that's correct in terms of some of the kind of basic mapping skills. We are starting to use generative AI and playing with it from a kind of synthesized data point of view. And we're also starting to build co-pilots as well on top of our platform. And actually, that's less for the very big firms. So the very big firms are all working away on co-pilots themselves. But we are building co-pilots using generative AI.
As I said in the beginning, the Engine B, part of what it's doing is leveling the playing field between large and small firms. I can understand why the ICAEW might want to have you do that, but why would the major firms, why would the big audit firms and the big law firms want you to do that?
It's interesting because actually doing the plumbing around data, client data, is actually just never going to be a core skill of the big firms. And actually the big firms are technology houses. So, I was a partner in 2 different of the big 4. And if you do a project in one of those and it's about something which is not core, I mean, you do something around core audit, except you're going to be the focus of attention. But if you do something which is not seen as directly core, which orchestrating data was, then you're going to create a huge cost base in the project right at the start. Partnership models, they're expensive models and they're not technology orientated. So actually somebody coming along and sorting out the plumbing and doing it across the industry where there's no perceived competitive advantage to having access to client data. They perceive correctly that their intellectual property around the nuances of how to apply law to a specific case or the analytics you can do on anomaly detection on the accounts, that's where the IP is. And it's not in the making sure the data is right. So I think it is a fair question. It's a question we got asked a lot. Amusingly, just to tell a story, we started off, obviously, when we started NGP, we had to get permission from the regulators and the associations in the UK and the US and elsewhere. And then we started working with the ICAEW because we needed somebody to convene the firms accounting firms, and we did some stuff with the Law Society as well, actually. And the accounting firms went, well, our data models are all very special. There's lots of differentiation in here. So we'll talk about 80% of our data model, but not all of it, right? And so we sat down and we covered off the 80%. And then the Institute took the 20% from all the different firms and went back and said they're all the same. So, there was a perception there was some differentiation, but they found out that really there wasn't. But the models are changing as well, because obviously now we have sustainability in ESG, which requires a broader set of data feeds as well. That model is expanding. They think they've all got special data models for ESG. They don't, and we're just going through that process again. So another wave through.
You suggested the competitive advantage, Shamus, was in things like having an understanding of how to apply nuances of the law to particular cases. But isn't the evidence of these nuances captured in the data of the actual cases that the company is involved in? So couldn't somebody reverse engineer these nuanced skills out of looking at the cases and say, aha, here's an interesting way to apply particular cases? So I'm making the case that maybe data is more important. After all, what's Google's strength? It's the algorithm, but it's the data. So maybe there is something to be preserved in data.
I think the definition of data and the use of data are slightly different things. So I totally buy your premise, by the way. And I think the premise is even more true now with generative AI. I'm happy to chat about that as well. But right now, what we're doing is defining what the data structure, the metadata might be. Is it a string? What's the acceptable range, etc.? That piece, it's easy to define and it's not differentiating. Actually, getting hold of the data and then leveraging it to work out the nuances is a point of differentiation. So, and the reason we work very closely with Microsoft is that they love us because we don't muck around with the data. So we have the kind of same attitude to data as they do. So we absolutely will never look at client data. So if we pull something out of a client system and we orchestrate it into a data model for a firm, then we never look at that data at all. We might do the transformation to it, etc., but we don't anonymize it and copy it. We're very religious about that, actually. And we've got certain kind of security mechanisms we put in place to make sure that we can't do that. So I think, David, to your point, the actual data itself, I think, is very important. It needs to be loved and protected. I think there are too many data extraction providers who don't do what we do, but they do parts of it, and they're copying the data, anonymizing it, and keeping it, which I find shocking. But we don't do that.
Don't you find that quite a few of your clients' data is in a pretty poor state? And do you quite often find you have to say, sorry, we can't actually do anything with this yet. You've got to go and turn this data swamp into a series of connected but sensible data lakes?
I talk about data swamps, and I always say, I'm going to use a technical term, all your data's shit, right? And I know that in advance without looking at it. So I think that's true. And we do a lot of work trying to clean that up. So some of it in the end is going to have to be done by the client. But if you can avoid that, you can.
So how can you do that without looking at the data?
Let's take lease contracts, for example. You can pull information out of the general ledger. So from the finance system. So you pull data out of the general ledger, the payables and receivables and etc., and even the fixed assets, right? So and you can start going, okay, I've got some data here, which is telling me about the rent, for example. And we built a property knowledge graph. And so you can go, inevitably, there will be more than one copy of the lease, unfortunately, because clients should all have contract management systems, but they don't. So you therefore go, okay, I've got 15 copies of the lease, lots of different changes in the terms and conditions, pricing, etc. And we start using the knowledge graph to try and work out which copy of the contract, whilst looking at the open banking feed and the general ledger and the accounts payable, might be the most likely contract to be the one which is currently in play. Because it's accounting and legal, but let's just say it's accounting, we have to present to them the contract we think is the most likely to be the one which is current and true. So we do things like that. Now, the finance system tends to be in reasonable shape. The problem with finance systems, of course, is there are at least 300 of them around the world, and most of them, or a lot of them, can be tailored to your needs. So we've got a whole lot of AI which does two things. One, we're going to get a bit boring on accounting data, but stay with me, right? So one of them is allows you to connect up to a brand new ERP. So a lot of people don't know this, but Tesla built their own finance system, their own ERP system. Now, there are some quite good ones around, like SAP and Oracle, I might suggest. So a bit odd that they decided to build an ERP, but they did. So we haven't actually connected into that one yet, but our view is that an auditor should be able to connect our system into the Tesla system in under an hour and be able to pull out the data in a way which is traceable and complete, etc. And we use a lot of Wave 1 AI to do that. And the second thing that happens is that the way they define the data, the chart of accounts to accountants, but the way they define the data is different by client as well. So we have to be able to take that and do some clever things to normalize that as well. So the data is always very poor. What we try and do is take, instead of weeks and weeks of work, take it down to hopefully minutes, but hours at the most.
And this business of reviewing the data and, for instance, with the property leases you talked about, asking the client, this is what we think is the model, or the contract you're currently actually using, is that right? Is that automated, or do humans look at the 30 different leases and take a guess which one's them?
They can look at it. We put forward the one we think is the correct one, and we explain why we think it's the correct one.
But is your review automated? Sorry, is your review automated?
Yes,
it is. Okay.
Using the knowledge graph, yeah.
But it's not a black box, you're saying. It produces an answer, and then it says, here's why we think this answer is good. So in a sense, it's explained AI, which humans can consider.
Exactly. David, that's exactly right. And not only that, but the property knowledge graph was designed, I was going to say by committee, that would be awful to say, but by a group of people, accountants, lawyers, and bankers, to make sure that the property knowledge graph, with all its design, will do the use cases across all three industries, if that makes sense. So we can then go back, okay, here is the evidence as to why we think this contract is the right one. So it's explainable. Yeah.
So you're clearly up and running commercially. You have clients who are using you in their systems and paying you money. What are you able to tell us about the state of play where you are in the growth curve? How much money are you making? Things like that.
Not enough. What do they always say? It's more than we need, less than we want, right? So we have clients in the UK and the US, and they are global clients, but they're rolling out in the UK and the US first, and then we're going to go into Netherlands, Germany, Spain, and then the rest of the world. So if you talk to us this time next year, we will be, from an audit point of view, and audit's one thin slice of what we do, but we'll probably be at about 200,000 audits worldwide. This year, we're at about 50,000 audits. So you think about it from a kind of 50,000 end clients whose data we're sorting out. So it's in quite rapid growth, but we're starting off in the UK and the US just because that's where the firms wanted to do it first. And I would say we are further ahead on accounting than we are on legal, but the generative AI piece has just flipped that on the head, I think. Well, not flipped on the head, but suddenly made everything a lot more interesting across all industries, I think.
So if this task is doing the work of auditing that previously humans were doing, especially if it's doing all the relatively easier parts, how are humans going to be trained to become better auditors?
Yeah. So that's something which has been discussed for a long time in terms of who are going to be the partners of the future if they haven't gone through that triangle. I think there's a lot of very fair arguments around that. A lot of the work which will get automated away first, David, is in fact going to be the very dull transactional work. And I would hypothesize that that work isn't actually giving you a lot of core skills which you're going to use as a partner. But both the legal and accounting industry have a problem because they rely on having that triangle of part at the top and junior staff at the bottom working away. People will fall out of that process as their careers go on, and you end up with one partner at the top. That's going to be a training issue, which is going to hit. And we're going to move to what we call a diamond shape. And that's going to be interesting to see. It's the problem which is not solved, to be fair. Saying that, though, if you look at the co-pilots we're working with at the moment, we're building, I think a lot of those will be there to augment junior staff and help them do things like related parties check. Related parties is really kind of going, are you doing transactions in a business with a supplier or a client to whom you've got some other relationship with, which just needs to be checked. We built a related parties co-pilot, and it pulled data from Companies House, You can do it with Edgar in the US, which is the equivalent in the US of Companies House, but pull data from Companies House and LinkedIn, and we gave it a methodology. So we took a methodology from the ICAEW, the Accounting Association, on related parties. We actually didn't edit it that much. We just put into a Copilot, allowed the Copilot to pull the data from LinkedIn and Companies House, and it pulled data from the Engine B ERP. We were testing on ourselves. And we said, right, okay, you're a audit team member, you're going to be focused on related parties, et cetera. We created a persona, and we asked it to go away and start the process. And it wrote a letter to me as the CEO and said, look, we want to go and interview these key staff, which we've identified, and we want to interview the non-execs, et cetera. And then it said, it identified that one of our board members of Engine B is also the CEO of the ICAEW. The ICAEW owns just under 15% of Engine B, and ICAEW also appears to be on our client list. And so to work that out from just doing the methodology, et cetera, and we need to interview the CEO of the ICAEW to understand how that transaction took place. Whilst people on this call might think that's kind of okay, and that's, it's not bad for generative AI, the accountants in the world were like, wow, just blow my head off. Now you can see that we could start to have a related parties check being done by relatively junior staff, actually, being augmented by great co-pilots. So we're building co-pilots, which actually I think will help train up and give more interesting work to junior staff. There will be co-pilots which will wipe out jobs, though. Let's be very clear.
Going back to the trainees and the managers and so on in the audit firms and the law firms, is it the case that ticking and bashing, which I think is the terrible process that young auditors have to go through to learn their trade, they're not going to do that in the future. Nobody's going to do that except for a machine. So is it the case that that isn't really needed to learn the skills to be a partner later on?
The partners of law firms and accounting firms kind of talk about, well, I did it and it was really good for me, et cetera. The reality is it brings no value, and it never has. It's a bit like in the legal industry trying to deal with deal rooms. Actually brought no value, and when technology got applied, we didn't see a sudden drop in quality legal staff growing up. I had an interesting conversation with a private equity house a couple of weeks ago. They may listen to this, so I won't say who it is, but we were going through generative AI, et cetera, and they went, gosh, if you get the co-pilots right, this could really do a huge amount in terms of what our junior staff do. And I said, yeah, no, they won't have to work 18 hours a day anymore, right, to go up the greasy pole in the private equity house. They can work normal hours and et cetera. And they went, no, we'll find other things for them to do for 18 hours. So I think that kind of, you still have to kind of hero work will stay around. But I think the hero work needs to go, especially if it's not value add.
So the ticking and bashing isn't necessary. So that's a myth that it won't enable junior people to become senior people later on. The other worry that a lot of people in professional services have is that the billable hours model will disappear. And I presume you've kind of debunked that as well, have you?
I would say when I was a partner in a firm, it was really difficult to get partners who were dealing with clients to sell the technology because they're used to selling billable hours, right? That model's going to have to change. I'm not saying there won't be billable hours, but you also need to have technology as part of the deal. I gave a talk in 2018 in Budapest. I looked at Professor Hinton's current research and went, hang on a second. If he manages to succeed in his current research around understanding the purpose and meaning of the whole sentence rather than words, this is going to have ramifications in terms of legal and accounting. That really was what GPT-4's become, right? And I talk about in that talk that the reality is that you need to change the model. And actually, I think the two different ways to do it. You sell the technology as part of the base price, or you sell team members, right? So our co-pilots could be sold on a per task job onto the client. You can imagine, therefore, you go, well, actually, our co-pilot for related parties has done 70% of this work, and we're going to bill you X for it. But it's going to be messy. I think it's easier to define the endpoint, just like the singularity. It's easier to define the endpoint, more difficult to define the transition.
I know that the future of jobs is a subject close to your heart, and I know this because we've discussed it many times. And I know that you agree with me that sooner or later, machines will be developed to the point where they can do pretty much everything that humans can do for money. And at that point, new jobs will continue to be created, but they'll be done by machines and not by humans. And I think, although I'm not quite sure whether we do agree with this, I think you agree with me that an economy of abundance is probably the solution to that. Has the arrival of GPT-4 changed your views about that anyway? Has it sort of moved your views on at all?
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
I've read two things in the last 24 hours, one from a strategy house and one from an accounting house, on whether their models of the future of work have changed. The accounting house said, oh yeah, things have moved forward. 7% of audit will be automated, which just going to go, you mean 7% will be left? But anyway, and the strategy house said that their view about when half the jobs will be fully automated has been pulled forward 5 years. Oh, by the way, that brings it to 2045. So they're going half the jobs will be automated by 2045. I think the problem with, especially the strategy house piece, which is a good paper and reasonably well laid out, I would suggest that they're making an assumption that basically nothing changes from technology from here on out, which I think is what people have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years. So I'm kind of going, that kind of moving on in terms of speed of change and technology development, etc., is not taken into account. I think there's going to be a much faster pain point reached than people realize. I think the next 10 years are going to be very painful because the job's going to rotate very quickly. And Callum, I do completely agree with you that at some point we're going to have all work done and there'll be an economy of abundance. I like the end point. I'm just not sure about the transition. But I think the transition is going to get painful faster than people realize.
As you say, it looks like a lot of the models are assuming just figuring out how to take advantage of today's technology or even yesterday's technology, since there's a slow period of adoption. Companies resist adoption. It's hard. They've got to unlearn before they can learn. It slows down their productivity in the interim step, and they are slow to adopt. And eventually, more companies will succeed in adopting yesterday and today's technology, and that will have an impact on jobs. But I agree with you, Shamus, that there is a bigger wave coming from today's AI and tomorrow's AI. What I've been looking at in the last 24 hours is an interview by Demis Hassabis, it's in Wired, in which he says they are going to outperform today's OpenAI's ChatGPT, not just by having larger models, but by applying more cleverness. The same kind of cleverness that they applied to develop AlphaGo. It's not just scale, it's also some human creativity in the algorithms, in the networks, in the policy interactions. Demis, of course, has to talk the talk. He has to say that Google's not going to be left behind, but I tend to believe him that there is a whole bunch of cleverness ready to be applied. And ChatGPT 5 may not simply be an extension, a scaled up version of what we've got today. It may be, as Demis says, a combination of the best of today's large language models and many other aspects of AI. So I'm with you. I see there's likely to be an acceleration of change. I also understand that various consultancy gurus don't want to frighten the horses, as it were. They don't want to tell their clients, my goodness, you're going to have to really think hard about this. They more want to say to them, well, there are challenges ahead, but we can tell you what to do. You need to slightly modify your training policy, slightly modify your skill set, slightly modify your processes, and you'll be fine. And that's how they get paid, by producing that kind of report.
But Shamus, I know that you're very well connected in the AI world, and you rarely have dinner on your own. You're usually having it with Jeff Hinton or Demis Hassabis or somebody like that. What are they saying about the near future? Are they expecting a new big bang? Because we've had two big bangs, one in 2012 and one in 2017. Are they expecting a new one anytime soon?
I think the next wave is going to be 3 or 4 different things happening at the same time. So I think the video content, I just don't think has really been pulled in. My hypothesis is that Whisper was created to be able to pull voice data off videos. That's my hypothesis. I don't know if that's true or not. But I think that leveraging video content into the same models will definitely happen. I think the human reinforcement learning, which GPT-4 did, obviously had a major impact. There's going to be more of that. I do believe that use of graph technology underneath is going to help ground some of this. Knowledge graphs are used by Netflix and Google and MI6, interestingly. And the way to think about them, if you think about a knowledge graph as being a mind map, we've all had the misfortune of going on a business course and doing a mind map. And I mentioned the property one earlier on. So you would, if you're designing that, you would kind of create a circle, put the word property in, and you put a line out going, well, there's a line out with location, and then another circle when you have the geolocation of it. And then you might have one on owner, freehold, and then lease to, and then the lease agreement and the terms, etc. And you can imagine that spider diagram growing and growing. And you can then connect to different data sources, and you can then start doing really clever things with that, right? So you can start walking through the graph and making connections with data, fine. You can start doing AI, the topology of the graph as well, and you can start making assessments about the maturity of the data relative to other sets. But knowledge graphs, therefore, if you can imagine, and this is the way we do our co-pilots, right? You kind of go, okay, you've got an issue you want to get solved, right? So related parties, you give it all the methodology, etc. The methodology is generic, so that's good. But you then kind of go, what we've got to do is in the prompt, we've also got to give the information about who the clients are of the audit entity, the suppliers, the key personnel, etc. And you can use the knowledge graph to do some really quite complex searches so that actually the prompt can be given a hold of that data in preparation for going into the large language model. And then when it comes out, you kind of ground on the way in and you can ground on the way out. On the way out, you can go, this has given me a view, and it's identified, in our case, Michael Isra is CEO of the ICAEW and also on the engineering board, and the ICAEW being a client, and some revenue coming through. So all of those facts we can recheck with the knowledge graph to make sure that actually the hallucinations aren't there. I think that you'll get a whole load of things which will start going on in terms of reinforcement learning off large data sets using knowledge graphs as well, right, on top of human stuff. But to David's point, there's going to be some stuff which are beyond the grey matter of the 3 people on this call, which people will come up with. And the argument about it is it just larger models? Is it just more data or better quality data? Or have we reached a kind of log curve where we're starting to flatten off on the improvements based on the size of the model? I don't know. And that debate's been had at the moment, isn't it? But I think there are going to be things which are going to go on. I think people should go and look at what Hinton's been working on. Some of the stuff he's doing at the moment is quite interesting.
It's interesting that there is a delay between a big bang happening, a big breakthrough in AI happening, and the world realizing it, even the AI world realizing it. I mean, the big bang in AI in 2012, when deep learning was introduced, very few people were aware of that until DeepMind got bought by Google in 2014, 2 years later. And really 2015 was the year that most people became aware. That was the year of the great robot freakout. So that was a 3-year delay. The current generative AI wave has its origins in the 2017 paper by Google researchers, Attention is All You Need. So that was kind of 5 years before the public. And I think most of the AI community really became aware of just how powerful transformers were going to be. So maybe there was something else that has already happened, which we will hear about in another 3, 4, 5 years. We may have already had the third. We just don't know about it yet. And the things that look to me that need to happen are, firstly, AIs need to have common sense. So they need to have a model, a good working model of how the world works, the basic laws of physics and so on. And I know, David, you always bring this up when I say this, that GPT-4 has figured out some basic laws of physics, but it needs to have an entire understanding of how the world works, the sort of understanding that a teenager has put together by experimenting with lots of things.
Shamus, is that what you mean by the graph knowledge, the connection of ideas?
I think we could definitely use it to work on that. Because you brought up the internal model thing, Callum, look, I think the internal model in GPT-4 has been shockingly brilliant, right? And whenever I talk to people who are not AI people, they kind of go, so what? And I'm like, no. the fact that the difference between 3.5 and 4 is that it can leverage its own internal, it seems to be able to leverage its own internal model. Right? I do think that the breadth and depth of that model, if it can grow and take in facts, physics and et cetera, I think would be amazing. And that's the next challenge. How do we do that? The knowledge graph can do some of that. But whether you want to do that outside of the model or in the model, I think you want to do it in the model rather than outside the model. I think the graph can ground, but I think you want to do it in the model. And if we can find a way of expanding that world model, making sure that world model has, I think physics is a great example. I always kind of go, if kids learn one thing, it's maths, then it's physics, then it's chemistry, then it's biology, right? Because one doesn't make sense without the one below. And I'm going to go, all of those things almost need to be learnt in that order by the model, the internal model, and then the world's going to be a very different place. I just don't know how we do that. I think you can ground it before and after using knowledge graphs and other tools and plugins.
Well, and the other way I would imagine that you can give a level of common sense to an AI is to have it go through a lot of the experiences that children go through. When we're building up our model of how the world works, if you have AIs look at lots of videos of things happening, and they'll figure out that if you throw a ball, it goes away from your hand, and if you catch the ball, it has a reaction when it hits your hand, and they'll understand that stuff in the way that children do. And you can probably speed that process up enormously by playing them videos at 100 times speed, and they'll get it. So an AI's childhood could be 3 years instead of 20.
Then you need to orchestrate the data in the right way, right? And go, actually, here's all the stuff from Khan Academy. It's going to be fairly reliable. It's fine. There's going to be lots of stuff which is going to be nuanced. And you're going to get a lot of people who are deniers. The world is flat, right? I would like the model to be capable of original thought and challenging assumptions, but I also want it to have some ground truth. Right? So we know the world's not flat. So can we move on from that, for example? So I agree, you could do it by videos, but you'd need to be able to ensure that it understood what ground truth was. And I worry that doing it the way you're doing it wouldn't necessarily give you that degree of certainty.
And then the other thing that AIs will need in order to get to HI is, and there may be many other things, but one other thing they'll need is the ability to pursue logical lines of thought and fact-checking, which is kind of part of that. And again, that's something that people have worked on a lot and can be folded in. So it wouldn't actually surprise me very much if there has been a third Big Bang somewhere and somebody's managed to get a rudimentary version of this working. And we're already well on the road.
When I try and get people to understand what GPT-4 is, and I talk about the internal model, and they go, well, it gets facts wrong. I'm like, well, you know what? Your brain is reasonably large. You read a book. I'm going to come to you and say, what's the fourth word on page 403? You're not going to know, but actually, could you give me a summary of what that chapter was about and how you felt about it? You can, right? And I think that's the way people should look at GPT-4, right, at the moment. So you're kind of going, it's a reasoning engine. Okay, it predicts the next word, but it's a reasoning engine, not a data fact engine. But if you think about the brain and consciousness and all those things, maybe we need different types of AI for different parts of the problem. And actually having a data store which is facts based will make some sense. You know, there's that great book, I think it's called Spark 2.1 Seconds or something like that, but which talks about how your brain works and how electricity goes through your brain and decisions are made. And I kind of read that book and I thought, actually, there's a lot of things which we can solve. But we want one model to solve it all, and I wonder if it's going to be 3 or 4 different models like the way the brain works. And then there'll be at some point some decision-making piece which goes, is this the right thing to do? Should I be waving my right arm in the air during the podcast? I don't know. Probably not.
So the three of us have got a fairly common view that there's likely to be significant disruptions in the world of AI quite soon. We don't know exactly what or when. But Shamus, you have the advantage of having more dining experiences with the movers and shakers of politics and business and so on. The people you're talking to, are they becoming alive to these possibilities? Are they giving it more mindshare? Or are they still preferring to diminish it and go back to today's problems?
I came and talked to about 30 or 40 heads of tax from large corporates from the US and UK the other day. And I had them for a couple of hours. And there was a quite interesting Toronto professor also talking about the legal singularity as well. So he and I were kind of working this through with these people. And at the beginning, there was skepticism. And the problem, of course, is that the models were released and we had hallucinations and people were not great prompt engineers and they were chucking all kinds of stuff in and getting rubbish out. But actually, to be fair, once they understood the differences between 3.5 and 4, once we taught them a little bit about how to do prompt engineering, once they understood that there's a reasoning engine, they definitely moved into this is going to make a massive difference. The only thing I'd say, David, is it feels like the globalization piece in the early 90s where everybody would go, yeah, no, absolutely. I think graduates in India and Sri Lanka, if we pay them 25% more than the standard in India and we've got fiber optic cable, we can move all of Jeff's jobs over there. But my part of the business actually is really super complex and it can't move. So I think we've got a bit of that going on. So I think people are waking up to what am I going to do for my kids? There's going to be a big transformation. But when they come to talk about themselves and their own team, they're still not totally alive to it yet. So I think it feels like that same moment all over again. The answer is, David, I think people who get to understand it, understand what the limitations are, but actually what it unlocks, I think are starting to understand the profound implications on jobs in the short term.
And everything else. Shamus, fascinating conversation. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurist podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I actually frankly could have done 2.5 hours on this, but anyway.
Yeah, well. Easily. Well, let's come back to it. Yeah.
Brilliant.
We'll come back to this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Colin.